Far from the only problem with utopian visions, but one worthy of note, is that almost by their nature they require a certain material homogeneity. Once again, although there are numerous further problems with this proposition when applied to the real world, the one that I will focus on here is the issue of children within these utopias. Before I do, however, I must emphasize that this video attempts to stay within the bounds of the idealized models rather than the implementations and practitioners. By utopia, I mean a perfect or near-perfect state of being proposed through an abstract constructed model. There is, perhaps, some room for discussion as to what might fall into this category, but certainly a few examples stick out. Furthermore, a distinction can be drawn between ideologies which are prescriptive, those which start from the abstract or a relatively small number of observations, descriptive, those which attempt to measure in totality and model on that basis, or which take a complete model from one area and attempt to universalize it, and emergent, those which are generated through use and tradition rather than imposed. To start, the namesake example, described by Sir Thomas More in Utopia, children are only a consideration insofar as they generate over or underpopulation as a problem to be dealt with. Within the largely pre-implementation frameworks of liberalism, children are largely either lumped in as subsidiary entities to the more important man, or further taken as an assumption which limits the options as a part of the minimum living standard of an adult. This is evident, for example, in Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. Alternatively, there is an undertone in the works of Locke of children forming the preceding state of an adult, and although this is somewhat true, it is still misguided. National Socialism, and to a slightly lesser extent fascism, has tended to make the same mistake, with children often seen as soldiers in waiting, but the picture in that regard is somewhat more blurry. Marxism, meanwhile, with its traditional materialist reductionism, and even in some of its more modern forms, tends to view children as a non-productive element, but one still requiring of resources to be sustained. As a slight aside, this may go some way towards illuminating why, when idealistic socialists first attempt to put their ideas into practice, minimization of births seems to be often an early priority. Again, this is a murkier picture, however, as exceptions exist, such as how Mao in China personally espoused pronatalist views despite presiding over an almost halving of the birth rate. All of these views are contrasted by an impulse in a great many people, and women particularly, who see children as ends unto themselves, and something which is a unique entity in itself, rather than a substandard version of the parent. So too, it is a logical necessity for the continuation of the system, as a utopia with no children is one which will itself die alongside its single generation of people. And while there will no doubt be some utopias which do not fall into this pitfall, it is a common enough trend amongst the mainstream ones that it ought to raise an eyebrow. A pop psychology viewing of this phenomenon might well yield some interesting thoughts, but a single clear observation will suffice here. That utopias, and the ideologies that inform them, are quite apart from the people they purport to serve, both in values and in objectives. At that, they can and do exhibit tendencies which are ultimately self-destructive. This is because, certainly in the case of prescriptive ideologies, but also somewhat in the case of descriptive ones, which can then carry prescriptive models forwards, such as capitalism, elements are missing from the totality of concerns, and thus are neglected. To circle back again, if all must be equal, then how are we to deal with an entity which is irrefutably not so, in all but the most exceptional cases? We either ignore it, or minimize its existence. This is, therefore, what separates prescriptive ideologies from emergent ones. No such emergent ideology, to perhaps draw a false equivalence in the use of that term, could maintain an anti-natalist outlook, for doing so would kill it through practice. So too would it find difficulty divorcing itself from the concerns of its people, for it would not be carried forward by them if it ignores what they actually need and want. In this way, although children are of course an important part of any society, they also function as a stand-in for all of those forgotten features of society which are not considered by an imposed prescriptive or descriptive ideology, one which is, perhaps, at the expense of the welfare of its people, chasing utopia.